Neale Hanvey.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. When I was elected to this place, I was elected on a prospectus for Scotland's independence, which is a completely legitimate argument. And when the honourable member, right honourable member from Somerset, was making his remarks some time ago, he's not in his place any longer, about the value of democracy, it rang rather hollow in my ears. And that's because whilst I respect England's right to vote for Brexit and to withdraw from the EU as they democratically expressed, what I don't accept is that the government benches, and indeed the opposition benches, feel that holding Scotland's democracy hostage is somehow acceptable. It is absolutely not. And the legislative process that's been considered this evening is being conducted without the consent of the Scottish people. It's not been consented to by our Parliament, it's not been consented in the referendum that was held. And whilst I do respect the right of withdrawal from the EU, it just feels rather disingenuous, to say the very least, that Scotland should be denied that right to withdraw from this union by the very people who embraced the withdrawal from the EU. And one of the second points I'd make in my opening remarks is that a part of the agreement between the Kingdom of Scotland and England that led to the Treaty of Union was that any law change should be to the evident utility of the people of Scotland. And that is set in the Articles of Union. And I see nothing in this legislation that is for the evident utility of the people in my Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath constituency. Scotland entered this union through the coercive influence of the English Alien Act in 1705 and the financial enticements of the Scottish parliamentary MPs who were bought and sold for English gold, and to the outrage and consternation of the Scottish people. There was rioting in the streets, the Act of Union was burned in various towns. So the result in 2016 for the EU referendum in Scotland of 62% is often dismissed, as is our history often dismissed, as irrelevant to the modern era. And that we voted as one country. Well, the fact of the matter is that the 1707 Act of Union created one state, but it did not create one nation. Scotland is a country. It has always maintained its identity as a country, even with the UN. And from the declaration of Arbroath to the claim of right, it is the people of Scotland who are sovereign, not a parliament and not a regent. And that is a fundamental difference between Scots law and English law. Scots law is underpinned in the common law by the claim of right, whereas English and many other jurisdictions are underpinned by Magna Carta. So there are two unions. There's the Union of the Crowns, and 100 years later there's the political union. But there was never a territorial union. Scotland is a separate and distinct people and country. And the importance of the claim of right was best demonstrated most recently when King Charles acceded to the throne. He had to swear to uphold the claim of right. And despite some of my former colleagues being elected in 2016 on an independence referendum, if Scotland were taken out of the EU against its wishes, subsequent elections have happened and no referendum has been brought forward. And despite pronouncements in this place and through words in other chambers, no referendum or preparations for a referendum have been forthcoming. Scotland has now been taken out of the EU against her wishes. Yes.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I don't know if he's not paying attention. But hasn't he noticed and recognised that there's going to be a referendum next year in November? And I know that Alba represents something like 0.7% of all voters across Scotland, but at least they could start to pay attention.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention. If he paid attention, the last poll put us considerably more than 0.7%, which I know he loves to trot out on Twitter along with his usual offensive messages. However, this legislative programme gives nothing to Scotland, and the preparations for the Scottish Government are supposedly making to rejoin the EU, it will undermine that. We now know what the UK Internal Market Bill was for. It was to facilitate the destruction of the devolution settlement, and that cannot stand. Scotland, in my position, in Alba, we should join EFTA immediately after our Parliament requires the competencies to sign international treaties and to abide by them. That would give us access to the European Economic Area immediately and give us free trade with the EU. It would also solve cross-border trade with the UK, because the UK already has an arrangement with EFTA. EFTA membership could be negotiated in weeks rather than the years that it will take for the EU process to complete. And that would leave Scotland in the wilderness. It is absolutely essential that EFTA is back on the table for the Scottish people to consider. We would also bring forward a written constitution by which Scotland will govern itself, and work with the variety of groups that have already brought forward developmental pieces of work on the constitution. And we consider that a series of citizens' assemblies would be much better placed than a committee room upstairs to consider the laws that apply to the Scottish people. When the people are free and independent, they must fashion the instruments with which they are to govern. The divisions of powers, the extent of those powers between the Parliament and the Executive, the franchise, the electoral system, the judiciary, the appointment of the judiciary, and the relationship between government, police and people, and the principles and values that describe us as the nation we want to be seen to be on the international stage. The written constitution should start from the principle that the people are sovereign, in keeping with the Scottish constitutional tradition. This would offer us greater economic and social stability than being shackled to a failing, visionless political union and this tawdry legislation. It is incumbent on all independent supporting MPs to act in concert through a constitutional convention to define the means to take us out of this dreadful union. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Very much, Alex Cunningham.
Thank you very much,